It was a cold and silent night. As I settled into bed, I felt a chill run down my spine. In the corner of the room, an indistinct figure slowly took shape. My heart raced as I recognized the ghostly face of my mother, who had died years ago. Trembling, I reached for the bottle of pills on the nightstand, took one, and gradually the vision faded away. "Lisa, we need to get ready for the move tomorrow," my daughter Heidi called from the hallway. Her words brought me back to reality, but my mother's incomprehensible whispers still echoed in my ears. The sound seemed to spread through the walls, creating a paranoid atmosphere that I couldn't shake. Those incessant whispers turned my stomach, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. At dawn, I packed our bags and tried to push away the memory of the previous night. Heidi was excited about the new house, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The ghost of my mother had planted a deep seed of fear in my heart, a fear that threatened to grow and take over me with every step I took towards the unknown. We arrived at the new house at dawn, and it was even more imposing than I remembered. An old structure with windows that seemed like eyes watching us. Andy, my husband, was proud of the renovation work he had done. However, as soon as we crossed the threshold, a sense of unease took hold of me. Heidi, ever curious, ran through the garden, exploring every corner. As Andy showed us each renovated room, I tried to ignore the strange oppression in the air. Heidi suddenly stopped and pointed to the window. "Mom, there's a man in a suit outside," she said with wide eyes. I looked quickly, but there was no one there. That chill down my spine returned with full force. During the inspection of the house, we found old photos of the previous residents. The most disturbing part was that all the faces were mysteriously scratched out. As we explored more of the house, the feeling of being watched only grew. Each old photo told a story, but none of them seemed to have a happy ending. Despite the renovation, the house retained an aura of mystery and sadness. Heidi kept asking about the man in the suit, and I couldn't find a plausible explanation. I tried to stay calm, but something told me our troubles were just beginning. The first nights in the new house were unsettling. Heidi, with her natural curiosity, explored every corner, even the abandoned cabin next door. One day, she came back from the cabin with wide eyes, saying she had seen a woman inside. "Mom, she was crying," Heidi said. I tried to ignore it, but deep down I knew her vision wasn't just a product of her imagination. My own experiences weren't helping to calm me. I started noticing strange movements out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't make sense. One night, while organizing the attic, I found an old doll. It was sitting on a chair, covered in dust. I placed it on a shelf, but the next day, the doll was in a different place, as if it had moved on its own. Its expression seemed to change, becoming more sinister each day. Andy tried to reassure me, saying it was just our minds playing tricks on us due to the stress of the move. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The visions continued, and the presence of that doll seemed to bring a negative energy to the house. Heidi kept talking about the woman in the cabin, and I began to fear that our nightmares were just beginning. One morning, I decided to explore the forest around our house with my sister Joyce. She also had the gift of seeing ghosts and might be able to help me understand what was happening. As we walked among the trees, we talked about our abilities and the visions we were having. Joyce seemed worried but determined to discover the truth. Heidi ran ahead of us, skipping between the shadows of the trees. Suddenly, she stopped and stared at something we couldn't see. "He's here, Mom." "Mr. Gordy is here," she said, pointing to an empty spot. Before we could ask more, a thick fog formed around us, obscuring our vision and filling the air with a piercing cold. We heard whispers and children's laughter coming from all directions, increasing the sense of terror. The atmosphere in the forest became unbearably heavy. Each step seemed harder, as if we were being watched by dozens of invisible eyes. The sound of distant laughter mixed with the whisper of the trees, creating a macabre symphony that made our hearts race uncontrollably. Heidi continued talking to the invisible Mr. Gordy, and I knew we were delving into a dark mystery that could consume us. One day, Heidi came to me with a serious and confidential expression. "Mr. Gordy said there's money buried in the garden," she whispered, as if afraid someone else might hear. Andy, always skeptical but curious, decided to investigate. Armed with a shovel, he began digging in the spot Heidi indicated. What we found was more than just money. It was an old, rusted swing chain buried next to a dirty old box. When we opened the box, we were horrified. Inside was a pile of human teeth, all clean and disturbingly organized. At the bottom of the box, we found a handwritten farewell letter detailing the tragic story of someone who hanged themselves on the property. The letter's content was dark, filled with despair and agony, making our blood run cold. The discovery shook us deeply. Andy tried to remain calm, but the tension was visible on his face. Heidi didn't seem surprised, as if Mr. Gordy had already prepared her for it. I, on the other hand, felt the house was revealing its dark secrets one by one, and I feared what else we might find. The presence of something evil seemed to intensify with each discovery, leaving us even more apprehensive. The visions began to intensify. Every corner of the house seemed to harbor a dark secret, and the presence of ghosts became almost constant. I saw shadows moving along the walls, indistinct figures that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. At night, I heard footsteps upstairs, even knowing everyone was asleep. The feeling of being watched never left me. Heidi continued her conversations with Mr. Gordy, increasingly absorbed in his stories. She told me about ghosts of slaves she saw in the forest, begging for help, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. I tried to protect her, but how could I shield my daughter from something I could barely understand? Reality and the supernatural blurred, making it impossible to distinguish between what was real and what was a product of growing fear. With each passing day, the house seemed more alive, but in a malevolent way. The nightly footsteps, the dancing shadows, and the whispered voices were driving me to the brink of madness. The negative energy was palpable, almost suffocating. I knew I needed to do something, but what? The fear of discovering the truth about the house and its former inhabitants was overwhelming, but doing nothing was not an option. My sister Joyce, always the curious one, decided to dig deep into the history of our new house. She spent days in archives, looking for any information that might explain the strange events. Finally, one night, she brought a box full of old records and photos of the previous owners. "You won't believe what I found," she said, her eyes wide with excitement and fear. Examining the documents, we discovered that the house belonged to the Gordy family, who helped slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. The photos showed serious faces, but what caught our attention most were the notes in the margins. Mr. Gordy, the last heir of the family, died 15 years ago under mysterious circumstances. "Lisa, this explains the ghosts," Joyce said, her voice trembling. There was one particularly disturbing photo of Mr. Gordy, where his eyes seemed to follow us. We uncovered even more disturbing secrets. The house was built on an ancient Native American burial ground, a sacred soil violated. The feeling that we were dealing with forces far beyond our understanding intensified. Each revelation brought more questions than answers. It was as if the house had a will of its own, determined not to let its secrets remain buried. I knew we were in the middle of something very dangerous, something we might not be able to control. That night, restlessness kept me from sleeping. I decided to try communicating with the spirits haunting our house. I took a candle and went down to the living room, where the air felt heavier and colder. Lighting the candle, I whispered, almost pleading, "If there's someone here, please manifest yourself." The flame flickered, and a shadowy figure began to form in the dim light. My heart pounded as I tried to stay calm. Meanwhile, Heidi was inexplicably drawn to the forest. She followed a pale light dancing among the trees, guided by a force I couldn't comprehend. She ended up finding a macabre hideout, full of human bones, some still with remnants of old clothes. Horror gripped me when I realized Heidi was missing. I ran through the house and the forest, calling her name desperately. Andy and I found her trembling, clutching a skeleton that seemed to be asking for help. The shadowy figure I had seen earlier appeared again, watching from a distance. The candles suddenly went out, and a cold, sinister presence filled the air. I fainted, feeling the darkness envelop me. When I woke up, I knew we needed to understand and appease these spirits before it was too late for all of us. The next morning, as we tried to process the events of the previous night, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, but on the other end of the line, there was only heavy breathing, accompanied by the metallic sound of chains dragging on the floor. The call was short, but it left a trail of dread that spread through the house like an invisible shadow. This happened several nights in a row, always at 3:33 a.m. Each time the phone rang, my heart skipped a beat. It was as if a dark warning was being transmitted. Heidi woke up scared every night, saying the ghosts were getting more agitated. "Mom, they don't want us here," she whispered with wide eyes full of fear. The calls increased the tension and the feeling that we were being pursued by something malevolent. Those disturbing calls began to affect our sanity. Andy tried to trace the number, but without success. With each heavy breath we heard, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. The chains we heard in the calls seemed to echo through the corridors of the house, even after the phone fell silent. I knew this was more than just a prank. We were dealing with something much more sinister than we could comprehend. We decided we needed professional help. Joyce suggested consulting a medium she knew, someone experienced in dealing with the supernatural. That afternoon, he came to our house, bringing with him an air of mystery and authority. As soon as he crossed the threshold, he frowned and said, "This house is a portal to the other side. We need to close this portal before the spirits become even more powerful." During the session, the medium fell into a deep trance. His eyes rolled back, and he began to speak in an ancient language, describing macabre rituals that had taken place in the house centuries ago. The room grew cold, and the candlelight flickered as if an invisible breeze passed through them. The presence of the spirits became almost tangible, and the sense of fear was palpable. Andy held my hand, trying to give me strength as we watched the frightening scene. The medium revealed that the spirits were trapped between two worlds, feeding off our fear. We needed to perform a ritual to close the portal and free the tormented souls. He instructed us to prepare a circle of salt and light candles at specific points in the house. Each word spoken by the medium seemed to carry weight, and I knew that the success of the ritual was our only hope for peace. The night following the medium's visit, we all had terrible nightmares. It was as if the spirits were retaliating for our attempt to expel them. In my dreams, I was chased by indistinct shadows, their icy fingers grabbing me, trying to pull me into the darkness. I woke up in a cold sweat, only to find handprints on my neck, as if I had been strangled during the night. The marks were deep and painful. Heidi was also affected by the nightmares. She woke up screaming, saying the ghosts were angry, their faces distorted by expressions of hatred. Andy, normally skeptical, woke up frightened, claiming he felt invisible hands trying to pull him out of bed. The tension was palpable, and fear turned our refuge into a true nightmare. No one could sleep peacefully anymore. The nightmares worsened each night. That night, I realized we needed to act quickly. The house wouldn't give us any respite as long as the spirits remained trapped there. Joyce suggested we hasten the ritual to close the portal, fearing that our dreams would become reality if we waited any longer. I knew she was right. The only way to protect my family was to confront the spirits and perform the ritual before the situation became unbearable. Supernatural events intensified, taking over our routine. Objects we were sure had been put away disappeared and reappeared in completely unexpected places. Clocks inexplicably stopped at 3:33, and the electricity frequently failed, leaving us in the dark for hours. Every night seemed to bring a new wave of strangeness and despair, as if we were constantly being tested by the house. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly hostile. Doors and windows opened and closed on their own, slamming loudly enough to wake us in the middle of the night. The temperature in some rooms dropped drastically, as if we were in the middle of winter despite the mild weather outside. These phenomena kept us in a constant state of alert, unable to relax or feel any sense of security. I knew we needed to act before the situation worsened even more. The feeling of extreme cold, the strange sounds, and the visions we were all having only heightened our anxiety. Joyce began drafting a detailed plan for the ritual, while Andy and I tried to stay calm and protect Heidi from all the horrors we were facing. The house was alive, and its clear intention was to destroy us. One night, as I tried to sleep, a feeling of absolute dread took hold of me. I opened my eyes and saw a dark figure at the foot of my bed. Its eyes glowed with a deep, threatening hatred. "You will never escape this place," the entity whispered in a voice that seemed to tear through the very air. Every word reverberated, leaving a trail of cold that infiltrated my bones. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or call for help. Heidi screamed in terror from the next room. I ran to her and found her huddled in the corner, pointing to the mirror. In the reflection, I saw the same man in a suit she had mentioned before, now inside the house, with a sinister smile and lifeless eyes. "Come play with us," he said in a voice that sounded like a distant echo. The dark figure manifested not only in mirrors but also on the screens of our electronic devices, repeating threats and revealing dark secrets of the family's past. It was as if he were everywhere, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. These constant apparitions and explicit threats were driving us to the brink of sanity. Andy tried to stay calm and rational, but even he was beginning to succumb to panic. Each night, the manifestations became more intense and violent, as if the entity were feeding off our fear. The malevolent presence in the house was slowly consuming us, and we knew we needed to act quickly to save our lives. Desperate and convinced that the house was destroying us, we decided to flee. We hastily packed our things and headed for the front door, but were stopped by invisible forces. The doors locked on their own, and the car wouldn't start, as if an invisible hand were keeping us there. Panic took hold of all of us. Heidi cried, clinging to me, while Andy struggled to open the doors with all his might. Amid the chaos, we heard screams and laments that seemed to come from within the walls, a macabre chorus that heightened our despair. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. With each failed attempt, the fear increased, and the house seemed to feed on this terror. Andy, in a final desperate effort, tried to force open the kitchen window, but was repelled by a force that threw him to the ground. I knew we were in a critical situation and that our lives were in real danger. We needed to find a way to neutralize the house's malevolent influence before it was too late. Faced with the urgency, we decided to perform the ritual to close the portal. Joyce and I, with the medium's help, prepared to confront the house's evil forces. We made a circle of salt in the living room and placed candles at strategic points, following the medium's instructions. The air was heavy, and the tension was palpable as we gathered around the circle, ready to begin the ritual. As the medium began to recite the ancient words, the house reacted violently. Objects started flying, lights flickered uncontrollably, and a cold presence filled the room, as if the house itself were resisting the spirit's expulsion. The temperature dropped drastically, and our voices trembled as we followed each step of the ritual. Despite the constant interruptions, we remained firm, determined to free the trapped souls and regain our peace. The climax of the ritual was terrifying. The house's invisible force seemed to be at its peak, trying to stop us at any cost. But finally, after a final chant, a wave of energy swept through the room, knocking us all down. The ensuing silence was deafening. The temperature began to return to normal, and the oppressive air diminished. We knew we had succeeded, at least for now. The spirits had been appeased, and the portal closed. Still shaken by the ritual, we realized Heidi was not with us. Panic set in, and we began searching frantically through the house and the surrounding forest. Finally, Andy found her in a grim hideout in the forest, clutching a skeleton. She was in shock, murmuring about voices guiding her there. The relief of seeing her alive was immense, but the sight of human bones around her increased our horror. As we rescued Heidi, we found several similar hideouts used to hide fugitive slaves. The inscriptions on the walls told stories of unimaginable torture and suffering. Each hideout seemed charged with negative energy, as if the souls of those who suffered there still cried out for justice. The gravity of the situation was overwhelming, and we knew our role was not only to save our family but also to appease the tormented souls of that land. Bringing Heidi back home was a challenge. She was scared and confused, and we were also emotionally exhausted. However, her connection with the spirits gave us a clue on how to proceed. We needed to honor the memory of the slaves who suffered there and bring peace to their souls. Only then could we hope for a peaceful life again. Our mission was far from over, but at least now we had a path to follow. Our encounter with the unknown in the House of Whispers taught us profound and unforgettable lessons. Although we managed to escape, the memories of the supernatural events will stay with us forever. And now, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever had a similar experience where you felt the presence of something beyond our world? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed our story and want to hear more about encounters with the supernatural, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our next scary adventures. Until next time, and beware of what might be watching you in the dark.